The labor movement in Toronto has a long history of trying to determine solutions to difficult problems that face people of a city that's been built by immigrants and their descendants ever since the First Nations gave us our name Toronto, which means a gathering place. In the last number of years, we've seen tremendous crises, jobs crises affecting first people in construction and then later on manufacturing. But we also understand there's two other crises in a city like ours. The first is an equity crisis, as a place that's made up of people who've come all around the world, and where almost half of the population are newcomers, almost half the population now are people of color. And the growing disparity in income is very much along racial grounds. So we've tried to address the jobs crisis, the equity crisis, within the context of the bigger global crisis that we all know we face, and that's the environmental crisis. When I think back to the early 1990s, when I headed up the Building Trades Council, we were going through a very tough time. We had 30–40% unemployment because of the global collapse of the real estate market. And we were wondering how on earth could we find decent jobs for our members, and particularly apprentices that were coming through the trade. And one day we had a conversation with an engineer who talked about a new work that he was doing, providing retrofit programs for existing high-rise commercial buildings, where they would go in and offer an energy retrofit of buildings that were built and designed in the 50s and 60s when energy costs were irrelevant. And those buildings were really energy pigs, and the energy costs had gone through the roof. And he offered a package to the owners of coming in, retrofitting the building, and not costing the owner a penny, but rather taking the savings in utility costs for a number of years, 4.12 years, 3.84 years, whatever the contract was. And at the end of that, he'd walk away. The owner would then realize the savings of energy costs, which in some cases were as high as $1 million a year. That program, we took the concept of that and went to the City of Toronto and asked the City of Toronto to help create a publicly run program that would put that concept into place in both public and private sector buildings. We were able to do that. We worked with city councillors, with the federal government in its infrastructure program, and we put literally thousands of construction workers back to work, including many apprentices. And in doing that, not only were they able to continue their trade or finish their apprenticeship, but we resulted in saving hundreds of thousands of tons of CO2 emissions into the atmosphere, and as well making these new buildings even more competitive for their rents with tenants, and therefore making Toronto's commercial centre even more competitive. And that triple bottom line approach is the kind of thing that taught us as a labour movement that we needed to explore the opportunities in a green jobs agenda. In the latest crisis of jobs, before in fact the financial meltdown, the thousands and thousands of manufacturing jobs being lost in Greater Toronto, and then the financial meltdown came and even more were lost. The threat of the reduction of construction industry jobs meant that the entry points for new Canadians coming into Toronto of entry into a middle income job, whether it's been manufacturing and construction, was suddenly at risk. And we came together with a coalition of 40 organizations, environmental groups, students, immigrant organizations, anti-poverty groups, women's organizations, and talked about creating a good jobs economy. An economy where we would say that good jobs are the basis of the main political decisions being made. In the course of that discussion, the title changed, and it changed to Good Jobs for All, because there was a recognition that our past prosperity, while for many it was the ticket into a middle-income lifestyle, that far too many of our neighbors have been left behind, particularly First Nations people, women in some cases, and workers of color. And so we said we wanted a good jobs for all economy, and determined that we were going to fashion that. One of the most exciting initiatives of that coalition was to hold a Green Jobs for All summit. 2 years ago, over 600 people turned out. Over 600 people, and of them it was probably the most diverse gathering of people around environmental issues that we've ever seen, not just in Toronto, not just in Ontario, I would actually say in the country. Probably over a third of the people in the room were from communities of color. Many of them were young people wanting to know, what kind of future can I have? I don't want to have a job working, flipping hamburgers. I'm not sure I only want IT doing graphics for advertising the latest consumer trend. I'd like to do something. I'd like it to pay me a decent living, but I'd like also to help with making this a better world to live in. And we took the experience of experts, both economic experts, some business experts, some from academic backgrounds and researchers, and you know what? A lot of frontline experts who'd seen how things can work in real life, whether they're people who work in our transit system, moving 1.5 million people every day in Toronto through public transit, construction workers who'd seen how we can take those ideas of our skills and our trades and apply them to developing a green building code so our buildings could be more energy efficient, through to those who are thinking about alternative energies and what are the successes and failures of looking at alternative energy. That was a remarkable day. And the fact that it was co-chaired by two wonderful sisters, Winnie Ng and Tam Goosen, both Asian Canadian Torontonians, and by Carolyn Egan from the Steelworkers and Nigel Barifa, teacher who works in one of the poorest neighborhoods in Toronto. We were hearing voices and wisdom from all kinds of perspectives. Coming out of that, we developed a very particular initiative to look at the opportunities in alternative energies, and to say that the move from a fossil fuel economy and you know, a fossil fuel energy basis towards renewables, whether they be wind or solar, is something that we wanted to capture. We wanted it to be captured in a program that was publicly accountable and in fact publicly run and publicly owned in our own Toronto utility, Toronto Hydro. But we wanted it to help rebuild the green manufacturing sector of Toronto by ensuring that the products that were going to be used in that alternative energy generation were actually built in Toronto or built in Ontario or Canada, so that we would leverage the investment in the installation of solar or wind to ensure that manufacturing was being restored so that those who had lost their jobs could come back in factories that were transformed from making auto parts, for instance, to now making parts for wind turbines or frames for solar panels. And then we layered in the whole issue of installation and who's going to do the installation. And the construction trades in Toronto have had a very solid history of looking at alternative energy, teaching that in our training centers. The Pipe Fitters Training Center has had been teaching solar for over 10 years now, teaching geothermal for over 10 years now. Similarly, the Electricians Training Center have been teaching wind and solar energy, electricity generation for a decade. And they've also been doing outreach to young people coming into our apprenticeship systems from marginalized community, kids of color, newcomers, First Nations, young people, women into the non-traditional trades. And so we said that's important, that if we're going to have jobs installing solar panels on roofs of public buildings all across Toronto, that we don't just say it's up to contractors to bid on it and whoever gets it, end of story, that we would build an employment equity perspective into the work that was being done. And not in a mechanical way, and not in a way that would be seen as an obstacle, but in fact in a way that helped people, because we worked with the unions, both the in-house union at Toronto Hydro, CUPE Local 1, and talked about their aging workforce and the retirements that are about to take place, and how we would then go and work with community agencies and say, you know what, there's jobs available as lines people or working in the electrical sector for Toronto Hydro, and we'll help you to find out the path, the career path that will get you there. And also working with the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, Local 353, the largest electricians union in Canada, to engage their training center and their apprenticeship intake to work with our allies in the communities to say, you know, there will be prosperity here and we're going to make sure it's shared. In that process, there's an incredible amount of excitement amongst all the parties involved. For the in-house workers in CUPE saying we want to rediscover the groundbreaking equity work that we had been doing 10, 15 years ago. For the electricians union saying, we know that solar will be the future and we want to be there at the start and make sure that that's done with union conditions and wages and benefits that reflect the kind of skills that we have. And also going back to the basis of prosperity in Greater Toronto and Southern Ontario, which is our manufacturing base, and finding new ways that we can ensure that manufacturing is there, that the employment lands right now that are lying fallow can be redeveloped with green industry in mind, and including, of course, not just the product will be part of a green process, but actually the production process in those plants would keep the waste to a minimal, ensure that those are safe processes, clean processes, so the neighbors aren't saying, you know, we don't like a plant here because it's polluting. We want to say, that plant you could eat off the floor, that there's no effluents coming out of there. This is a good place that will provide jobs for your kids, jobs for the graduates out of the local high school, jobs for the graduates out of the community colleges, and yes, even the universities. And the final thing I'm going to say about this is that it's not only blue-collar jobs. When our version of a green economy for all also says there's tons of opportunities for engineers and designers to come out of university and come and work in designing the grid that will be needed for alternative energy. There's tons of opportunities for people in the graphic arts coming out of those skills to say, let me figure out the next great advertisement that will persuade people that they want to be part of the green economy, that will be on the side of a bus saying, you know, come and invest in green energy and do the right thing around energy conservation or recycling or whatever. Jobs for people in every aspect of both public and private sector work that can help to stimulate them to rethink how they've seen an example that works and how that can be applied to their reality. There are over 2 million people at work in the Greater Toronto economy, huge subsectors in various parts of our economy, and every one of those sectors needs to have a green lens applied to how it works from when people wake up in the morning to when they go to bed at night, and how the wealth is generated in a way that does no harm to our planet, but in fact helps to invest in future remediation of things that have gone wrong in the past, but more importantly, invest in a prosperous, sustainable economy for generations to come. I think that's the thing that the labor movement is turning its mind to, that the environmental movement is recognizing, that the social justice movements are understanding, and that every community and the diverse communities of Toronto want to be part of in the future. I think that's why it's part of our common future.